The morning sun painted the sky in shades of soft gold and blush, casting a warm glow over the quiet countryside estate where Emma's wedding was set to take place. The air carried the scent of blooming roses and freshly cut grass, and inside the bridal suite, Emma stood before an ornate mirror, adjusting the delicate lace of her veil. It was supposed to be the most magical day of her life, a day filled with love, laughter, and the promise of forever. But as she smoothed the fabric of her gown, an uneasy feeling settled in her chest. Something felt off. She glanced down at Max, her aging Labrador, who lay curled beside her feet. He had been her constant companion for 13 years, through heartbreaks, triumphs, and every quiet moment in between. He was more than just a pet, he was family. Today, he had been quieter than usual, his once bright eyes clouded with something Emma couldn't quite place. "You okay, buddy?" she murmured, running her fingers through his fur. Max let out a deep sigh, his tail barely flicking in response. Brushing off the unease, Emma took a steadying breath. The ceremony was about to begin, and she had no time for hesitation. Little did she know, her perfect wedding day was about to take a turn no one would ever forget. The soft melody of the string quartet drifted through the air as guests took their seats, their excited chatter blending into a symphony of joy. At the altar, Daniel stood tall in his navy blue suit, his expression a mixture of love and anticipation as he waited for his bride. The aisle was adorned with white peonies, their petals fluttering gently in the breeze, and the world seemed to slow as Emma took her first step forward. But just as she lifted her foot, a sudden weight pressed against her leg, halting her movement. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as all eyes fell on Max, who had positioned himself firmly in front of Emma. His body, though aged, stood strong and unmoving, his deep brown eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. Murmurs spread like wildfire through the guests. "What's he doing?" someone whispered. "Is he trained to do that?" another voice questioned. Emma's father, standing beside her, frowned in confusion. "Emma, come on," he urged, reaching down as if to guide Max away. But the moment he extended his hand, Max let out a low, guttural growl, something he had never done before. The sound sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. Emma's heart pounded. Max had never been aggressive, never displayed even a hint of defiance. Yet here he was, blocking her path, his body language speaking volumes. He wasn't just standing in her way.
He was trying to tell her something.
A deep knot of anxiety coiled in Emma's stomach as she knelt before him, her pristine dress pooling around her like a cloud. The world around her blurred, the whispers of the guests fading into nothing as she focused solely on Max. His chest rose and fell in uneven, shallow breaths, his paws trembling slightly beneath him. "Max, what's wrong?" she murmured, cradling his graying face in her hands. His body pressed against her, as if seeking reassurance, as if urging her to understand. A sudden realization struck her like a lightning bolt. This wasn't stubbornness or misbehavior. This was a cry for help. Panic surged through her veins. How had she missed the signs? Had he been struggling all morning while she was too distracted by the wedding preparations to notice? A lump formed in her throat. She couldn't ignore him. She wouldn't. She turned to her father, her voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside her. "Something's wrong with Max," she said firmly. "I need to get him to the vet." A stunned silence followed her words. Her mother's eyes widened in disbelief. "Emma, sweetheart, this is your wedding day," she reminded her gently. "The guests are waiting." But Emma barely heard her. All she could see was Max. All she could feel was the deep, unshakable bond that had tethered them together for over a decade. There was no hesitation, no doubt. "The wedding can wait," she said, lifting Max into her arms despite his weight. "I'm not leaving him." As she carried him toward the car, her wedding dress gathered dust and grass stains, the delicate embroidery catching on the pavement. But she didn't care. The only thing that mattered was getting Max the help he needed. Behind her, she heard hurried footsteps, Daniel's. "I'm coming with you," he said without a second thought, already pulling out his phone to call the emergency vet. Emma's chest tightened at the unwavering love in his eyes. If there had ever been any doubt about the kind of man she was marrying, it vanished in that moment. The sound of car doors slamming echoed in the quiet countryside as they sped away from the venue, leaving behind the shocked murmurs of their guests and the picturesque altar that now felt meaningless compared to the life hanging in the balance. Emma sat in the back seat, cradling Max's head in her lap, her fingers stroking his fur in a desperate attempt to keep him grounded. His breathing was labored, his body heavier than ever. "Stay with me, Max," she whispered, tears burning the back of her throat. Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened. "We're almost there," he assured her, though the fear in his voice betrayed him. Every second felt like an eternity, each heartbeat a painful reminder of how fragile time truly was. The clinic doors swung open before they even reached the parking lot, as if fate itself had paved the way. Dr. Langley, their trusted veterinarian, rushed forward, his expression darkening the moment he laid eyes on Max. "Bring him in," he instructed, already moving toward the exam room. Emma followed, her hands trembling as she placed Max gently on the table. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled her lungs, the cold clinical lights a stark contrast to the warmth of the day she had left behind. Daniel stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, a silent pillar of strength. Dr. Langley ran his hands over Max's body, his practiced movements filled with a quiet urgency. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before he finally looked up, his face etched with sorrow. "Emma," he said gently, his voice laced with the kind of empathy that only comes from years of delivering heartbreaking news. "Max is in heart failure. It's advanced." The words hit her like a freight train, knocking the breath from her lungs. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That can't be." But deep down, she had known. The subtle changes, the moments of fatigue, the way he had been slowing down, she had just refused to see it. Her vision blurred with tears as she reached for Max's paw, holding on to him as if sheer willpower could keep him here longer. "How long?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Langley's eyes softened. "Not long," he admitted. "Weeks, maybe months. We can give him medication to keep him comfortable, but—" His words trailed off, unnecessary. Emma already knew. The weight of it crushed her, but she swallowed back her sobs, refusing to let grief steal these last moments from her. She turned to Max, who gazed up at her with tired but trusting eyes. "You knew," she murmured, realization dawning upon her. He had stopped her because he knew his time was running out. He hadn't wanted her to walk down that aisle without understanding that he needed her one last time. And she had listened. She had chosen love over tradition, over expectations. And in doing so, she had given him what he needed most, her presence. Daniel's voice was steady despite the pain behind it. "What do we do now?" he asked, his hand never leaving Emma's. Dr. Langley hesitated for a moment, then gave them an option neither of them had expected. "I know this isn't how you imagined today," he said carefully. "But if you still want to get married, we can do it here." With Max by your side, Emma's breath caught. It was unconventional. It was unplanned. But as she looked at the dog who had been her constant, her guardian, and now her greatest teacher, she realized something profound. A wedding wasn't about the flowers, the dress, or the perfect setting. It was about love, the kind that stays, the kind that endures, the kind that chooses you even in the hardest moments. And so, standing in a small clinic, surrounded by the hum of medical equipment and the quiet understanding of those who knew love when they saw it, Emma made her choice. She turned to Daniel, her heart full despite the ache. "Let's do it," she said, her voice steady. "Let's get married here." And in that moment, she knew this was what love truly meant. The clinic, usually a place of quiet urgency and whispered conversations, was now filled with a sense of warmth and purpose. The idea of holding a wedding inside a veterinary office might have seemed absurd to anyone else, but for Emma, Daniel, and everyone who had gathered around them, it felt like the only thing that made sense. The sterile white walls and the faint scent of antiseptic faded into the background as love took center stage. Emma stood beside Max, her fingers gently brushing his fur as he lay comfortably on a soft blanket the vet techs had placed beneath him. His breathing was slow, steady, and though his body was weak, his presence filled the room with something unspoken, a quiet, undeniable love. Daniel took her hands in his grip strong, unwavering. His suit, once pristine, was now slightly rumpled from their rushed exit, but none of that mattered. The way he looked at her, with absolute devotion and understanding, made Emma's breath hitch in her throat. This wasn't the wedding she had planned, but as she stood there, surrounded by the people who mattered most, she realized it was the wedding she had always needed. The minister, an older man with kind eyes, stepped forward with a small, knowing smile. He had officiated countless ceremonies in grand ballrooms, candlelit chapels, and sprawling vineyards, but never before had he stood before a bride still in her dust-streaked wedding gown, her hands entwined with a groom who had proven his love before vows were even spoken. Yet, in that small room, beneath the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic sound of Max's breathing, there was more love than any cathedral could ever hold. Marriage is not about perfection, the minister began, his voice steady, resonant. It is not measured by the grandeur of the day, nor by the perfection of the details. Marriage is about love, the kind that endures, the kind that chooses you over and over, even in the unexpected, even in the hardest moments. Emma felt a tear slip down her cheek as Daniel squeezed her hands gently. There was no audience filled with hundreds of guests, no extravagant decor, no meticulously planned music cueing their every move. Instead, there was only this moment, raw and unfiltered, shared with the one who had been her protector for over a decade, and the man who had just proven he would be by her side for the rest of her life. As they exchanged vows, Emma could feel Max's presence grounding her, reminding her why she had stopped in the first place. Love wasn't about perfection, it was about choosing to stay, choosing to be present. Daniel's voice was thick with emotion as he spoke, his words carrying the weight of every promise he intended to keep. I promise to love you in the quiet moments and in the chaos, in the planned and in the unexpected. I promise to stand by you, just as you stood by him today, because love isn't about where we are, it's about who we are with. Emma swallowed past the lump in her throat as she whispered her vows in return. I promise to love you with the same devotion Max has shown me, to be loyal, to be steadfast, to be home. I promise that even when life doesn't go as planned, I will choose you, just as you have chosen me. As the minister pronounced them husband and wife, a small, knowing sound filled the room, a soft, contented sigh from Max. It wasn't a bark or an excited wag, but it was enough. Emma knelt beside him, pressing her forehead against his, her wedding dress pooling around them. We did it, buddy, she murmured, stroking his fur as her tears mixed with laughter. You got to see me get married after all. And for the first time that day, she knew Max had held on for this moment. He had stopped her not just to save himself, but to give her the clarity she needed. Because love wasn't about the perfect wedding. It was about this. The days that followed felt like a gift wrapped in bittersweet ribbons of time. Max's condition was fragile, his energy waning, but the light in his eyes remained, as if he, too, understood the weight of every borrowed second. Emma and Daniel postponed their honeymoon without hesitation, choosing instead to dedicate their days to making sure Max's final moments were filled with nothing but love. The guest list had shrunk from 100 to just the 3 of them, but there was no resentment, no regret, only gratitude. They filled their days with slow walks through the park where Max had once bounded with endless enthusiasm, now moving at a pace that matched the rhythm of their own hearts. They cooked his favorite meals, watching as his tail flicked lazily in appreciation. They stayed up late, curled together on the couch, whispering stories of their favorite memories as Max lay between them, content in the warmth of their presence. There were good days. Days when Max seemed almost like his old self, his tail wagging, his eyes bright, his spirit untouched by the weight of his failing body. On those days, they laughed, they played, they captured every moment in photographs that would later become treasures. But there were also hard days, days when his legs trembled too much to stand, when his body refused to keep up with his heart. On those days, Emma would hold him close, whispering reassurances, reminding him that he had nothing left to prove. "You've done enough, Max," she would murmur, pressing her face into his fur. "You've loved me enough for a lifetime." Daniel, ever the steady presence, became the quiet strength Emma needed. He never once questioned the importance of these moments, never suggested that they move on or look ahead. Instead, he sat beside her, holding her hand, holding Max, holding space for the love that had shaped their lives. He understood what Emma knew in her soul. This wasn't about counting the days. It was about making the days count. And then, one morning, as the first hints of spring touched the air, Max let them know it was time. The sky was clear, the world peaceful, as if the universe itself had decided to grant him a perfect farewell. Emma and Daniel spent the day with him beneath the shade of the old oak tree in their backyard, the same tree Max had claimed as his favorite spot years ago. They fed him his favorite treats, whispered endless thank yous and I love yous, and held him close as he lay between them, his breathing steady but slow. And when the moment came, when his body finally surrendered to the weight of time, he went the way he had lived, surrounded by love. The silence that followed was deafening. The house, once filled with the comforting sound of paws against hardwood, now felt unbearably still. Emma sat on the floor where he had last rested, her fingers clutching his old collar, her heart aching with a grief that felt impossible to bear. "I don't know how to be without him," she whispered, her voice breaking. Daniel knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her, his own eyes filled with sorrow. "You don't have to be," he said gently, "because he's still here. In everything. In us." In the weeks that followed, they found ways to honor him, not just in words, but in actions. They planted a garden beneath the oak tree, filling it with flowers that reminded them of his unwavering love. They kept his leash by the door, not as a symbol of sadness, but as a reminder that love never truly leaves, it simply changes form.